the hardest decision of my life and how it saved me. I was never the daughter my mother wanted. For as long as I can remember, she had a perfect mold in her head. A submissive woman, devoted exclusively to her husband, home, and children, without questioning anything. My sister Helena seemed born to fit that mold, not me. While she smiled and said yes to everything, I asked, why? And that in my house was almost a crime. We grew up in this suffocating environment, where every step was monitored and every choice criticized. Before everything happened, I believed I could find my own way, but I didn't yet know how much it would cost. My name is Rosanna, and this story happened about 5 years ago, when I was 26. At the time, I was finishing my postgraduate degree and working in an architecture firm. I loved my job and felt like I was finally gaining my place and independence. But at home, I felt like I was always walking on eggshells. My mother thought I was wasting time and energy on modern nonsense, as she called it. She thought I should be focusing on finding a decent husband and learning how to take care of my house. Helena, my younger sister, was already engaged to Ricardo, the boyfriend my mother practically chose for her. I always knew my relationship with my mother was complicated, but there was still a glimmer of hope that one day she would accept me as I was. That changed the moment I met Jorge. He appeared at a time when I was determined not to let anyone get in the way of my career. But he was different. A calm, respectful man who looked at me as if I were enough just the way I am. For the first time, I felt like someone truly saw me. However, to my mother, Jorge was just another threat to the order she had imposed on our family. At first, I tried to hide our relationship to avoid conflict, but it was impossible. My mother had a radar on everything I did. When she found out, her reaction was immediate. She said Jorge wasn't the man for me because he encouraged me to work and be independent. To her, this was a flaw, not a virtue. Helena, influenced by my mother, began to avoid me and repeat the same venomous phrases. It was as if I had become the enemy of my own family. Up until that point, I was still trying to reconcile things. I thought that if I explained things calmly, they would understand that Jorge was good for me. But each attempt only generated more attacks. My mother's messages became more frequent and aggressive. She insinuated that Jorge was with me out of self-interest, that I was selfish for not following her values, and that I was embarrassing the family. The worst part was seeing Helena treat me coldly, as if I had betrayed our sisterly alliance. The height of control and manipulation came at Christmas that year. Jorge insisted we go to dinner, trying to maintain some kind of connection, even if minimal. I was apprehensive, but I agreed, thinking it might be an opportunity to improve things. I was wrong. From the moment I arrived, I noticed the sidelong glances, the whispers, and that heavy atmosphere that only those who live in a controlling family understand. My mother completely ignored Jorge, and with every comment she made, she seemed to try to belittle me in front of everyone. The provocations mounted until, in a heated argument, my mother lost control. The words turned to shouting, and the shouting turned to shoving. Helena, instead of intervening, sided with her, accusing me of being ungrateful and dramatic. I felt a mixture of anger and pain I can't describe. It was as if, in that moment, I had lost not only my mother, but also my sister. Jorge practically forcibly removed me, protecting me while I still tried to process what had just happened. That night was the turning point. Lying in bed, still shaking, I realized there was nothing I could do to change my mother. I'd spent years trying to win her love by being someone I wasn't, and it only destroyed me inside. I made the hardest decision of my life, to completely cut ties. I blocked numbers and social media accounts, and promised myself I wouldn't go back. But it wasn't easy. My mother couldn't accept the separation, and began a campaign to harm me in every way possible. The attacks began subtly, with rumors spread to acquaintances and distant relatives, but they soon became more serious. She began calling my clients, inventing lies about my work. On one important project, I nearly lost the contract because of false comments she spread. Helena, still manipulated, participated in these advances. It was incredibly painful to realize that my own sister was helping to sabotage my life. It was at that moment that Jacqueline entered my life. She is Jorge's sister and a lawyer. Until then, I didn't know her much, but when Jorge told her what was happening, she didn't hesitate to help me. Patiently, she explained how I could take legal action to protect myself. I confess that at first I felt guilty, as if I was going too far by suing my own mother. But Jacqueline made me see that this wasn't revenge, it was survival. While the legal part was being sorted out, I had to face the emotional part. The silence after cutting contact was deafening. I cried a lot, not only because of the loss of contact, but also because of the loneliness that came with it. Friends tried to support me, but it was difficult to explain the depth of the pain of cutting ties with my own family. It was like experiencing a mourning without a burial, without end. Jorge became my safe haven. He reminded me every day that I didn't have to carry this guilt alone. Even so, there were times when I almost backed down. I remember one night dreaming of my mother smiling at me, as if everything had been resolved. I woke up with a tight chest, wanting to pick up the phone and call. But I remembered everything that had happened, and I took a deep breath. I relearned that sometimes loving someone means letting them go, especially when that love is accompanied by destruction. Over time, I began to feel the first stirrings of freedom. It was strange not having anyone monitoring my schedule, my clothes, or my choices. I began to invest more in my work, and projects began to come more easily. Still, lies continued to crop up here and there, but now I was more prepared to deal with them. Jacqueline managed to get a restraining order issued, which gave me a bit more security. Helena, on the other hand, seemed increasingly trapped in my mother's control. I tried not to think about it too much, but it was impossible. She sent me a short message on my birthday, emotionless, as if following protocol. Deep down, I still hoped that one day she too would find the courage to break out of that cycle. But I knew I couldn't save her. Just as I had to choose, so would she. Today, looking back, I realized that that Christmas was simultaneously the worst and best day of my life. Worse, because it marked the definitive break with my mother and sister. Better, because it was the day I finally decided to live my own life, without asking permission to exist. It wasn't easy, and it still isn't. But I learned that my peace is worth more than any blood ties. And above all, I learned that family is also made up of the people we choose to keep by our side. After cutting off contact, I began to rediscover who I was without my mother's and sister's voices echoing in my head. At first, it felt like everything was silent, but I soon realized it was more than silence. It was space. Space to think, to feel, to make mistakes and learn without fear of punishment. I began doing simple things that had previously been almost forbidden to me, like traveling alone for a weekend, choosing the clothes I wanted to wear without imagining nasty comments, or simply spending an entire Sunday without fulfilling daughterly duties. Therapy was another turning point. I'd tried before, but always gave up, because somehow my mother made me feel like seeking help was a sign of weakness. This time, I followed through. I understood that I'd been carrying behavioral patterns that weren't my own, but rather learned ones. I discovered that my inability to trust people, my fear of making mistakes, and even my self-sabotage stemmed from years of criticism and manipulation. It was painful, but also liberating, to realize that those didn't define who I was. As I rebuilt myself, Jorge was always there. He never tried to rush my process or minimize my pain. He understood that my struggle wasn't just against what my mother did, but also against everything I had internalized. Often, we would just sit together in silence, and that was more healing than any words. He gave me something I'd never had, the freedom to be vulnerable without fear of being used against me. Work also became a refuge. I threw myself headfirst into projects, and this brought me significant achievements. One of the clients I nearly lost because of my mother's lies ended up recommending me for an even larger contract. Little by little, my professional reputation strengthened, and this undermined her attempts to undermine me. I realized that no matter how much noise she made, I could build something solid enough to withstand it. Still, there were days when I missed her. Not for my mother as she was, but for the mother I wished she were. I missed having a close-knit family, missing being able to call my sister to talk about anything. At those times, the pain was almost physical, but I learned that missing someone doesn't mean I have to return to a place that hurts me. It's possible to miss someone and, at the same time, know that staying away is the best decision. Jacqueline was fundamental in this process. More than my lawyer, she became my friend. She taught me not only about rights, but also about boundaries. I no longer needed to justify every step I took. I didn't need to explain myself to those who didn't want to understand. This, for me, was one of the greatest victories, understanding that I owe nothing to those who only want to control me. The case against my mother dragged on for months, but the final outcome was favorable. She received a legal warning and was ordered to cease contact and defamation attempts. It wasn't a magical closure. It didn't change who she was, but it did change my ability to respond. I knew that now there was a limit imposed not only by the law, but by my emotional strength. As for Helena, the news was sad. Her relationship with Ricardo seemed increasingly suffocating, and my mother continued to control her every move. There were times when I considered trying to talk to her, but I gave up. Not because I didn't care, but because I understood that I couldn't fight for someone who wasn't yet ready to fight for herself. This was one of the hardest lessons. As time passed, I began to redefine what family meant to me. I grew closer to friends who had always supported me, forging new bonds with people who shared values and mutual respect. Holidays, which had previously triggered anxiety, became moments of joy. I spent last Christmas with Jorge and his friends, and for the first time in years, I returned home with a light heart. Deep down, I realized that overcoming wasn't a single moment, but a series of daily choices. Every day, I chose to continue on the path that kept me free, even when the temptation to return to the old pattern arose. Overcoming wasn't about forgetting, but about learning to live without letting the past determine every step. I've also learned to look at myself with more compassion. For a long time, I blamed myself for not cutting ties sooner, for having endured so much. Today, I understand that I did what I could with the tools I had. When I found strength and support, I was able to act. And that, in itself, is a victory. My relationship with Jorge grew much stronger during this period. We went through trials that would have destroyed many couples, but in our case, it only strengthened our trust. He saw me at my worst and stayed there, without trying to change me, simply encouraging me to be who I wanted to be. This showed me that true love doesn't suffocate, doesn't diminish, but expands. Every now and then, I still run into someone who knows my mother or sister. Some try to bring me news, others ask questions. Today, I don't shy away from these conversations, but I don't get bogged down in them either. I answer what's necessary and move on, because my life is no longer defined by them, and that's one of the greatest freedoms I've ever experienced. If I could give one piece of advice to anyone going through something similar, it would be, don't wait for the person who hurt you to change so you can be happy. Sometimes, change needs to start within yourself, even if it means distancing yourself from the one you love. It's not easy, and it will hurt, but later on, you'll realize it was the most important step. Today, my life is quieter in a good way. I have peace to work, to love, to rest. I still carry the scars of that history, but they no longer define me. And if one day my mother or sister decides to change, I'll be open to talking, but only in a space of mutual respect. Until then, I continue building my life, free, conscious, and above all, at peace.